Hello, everyone. It's really good to see you all, new friends and old. So, we're here this evening, or this morning in some cases, to talk about the three Clerks. And the first thing to say is that I've greatly enjoyed spending some time with this book over the past weeks, and I hope you have too. I do find it to be fascinating for many different reasons. But it's also, or so it seems to me, quite a strange novel and really quite challenging. Various in its preoccupations, unusual in its plotting and structure, sometimes extreme in its tone and relations with the reader. Not easy to pin it down. Perhaps partly because Trollope was addressing or perhaps coming to terms with a number of distinct themes and was still, to some extent at least, feeling his way as a novelist. It's not a highly polished novel, but it is very engaging and it's full of energy. So I'll begin with a few observations as to where it fits in Trollope's life as a writer. This was his sixth novel, and it came at a time when he had at last begun to achieve some real success. He was 42 years old when it was published in 1858, still a relatively young man, though no longer very young, and full of ambition, both in terms of his prospects in the civil service and his writing career. He'd published two Barchester novels, The Warden in 1855 and then Barchester Towers in 1857, just the year before The Three Clerks. The relative success of Barchester Towers meant that he felt entitled to a better bargain when he came to sell The Three Clerks. Trollope had confidence in this new novel, and indeed he never lost faith in it, describing it in his autobiography as certainly the best novel I had as yet written. And it is worth adding that critics and readers at the time agreed with him. It was published by Richard Bentley, not the most prestigious of publishers, and it was warmly received on the whole. Even the notoriously bad-tempered Saturday Review spoke well of The Three Clerks. It was another step on the way to success and fortune as a novelist. But more recent opinion has not been so positive. Critics haven't had much to say about it, and if they discuss the novel at all, it tends to be in terms of its autobiographical reference, or its views of the civil service, or its hostility to the system of competitive examinations. As far as readers are concerned, it hasn't been nearly so popular as its immediate predecessor, Barchester Towers. Now, of course, one of the best loved novels in Trollope's oeuvre. So, one interesting question for us to reflect on today is why this novel is so different to Barchester Towers and why it has had a much less positive profile among modern readers. What led Trollope to take such a different path in The Three Clerks? One thing that readers and critics do agree about is that this is an unusually autobiographical novel and that it is centrally concerned with Trollope's remembered experiences as a young man making his way in London. The three Clerks of the title, Harry Norman, Alaric Tudor, Charlie Tudor, are all attempting to make their way as London clerks in the lower ranks of the civil service. The novel tells the story of their differing professional and personal fortunes, and it's centrally concerned with the reasons for this difference. The three young men are linked to three young women, Gertrude, Linda, and Katie Woodward, the daughters of a clergyman's widow. Like the three Clerks, the three girls are to some extent defined against each other, with their respective merits compared and contrasted as they grow to maturity, and each of them finds a husband among Trollope's trio of clerks. So the youngest of the clerks, Charlie Tudor, is in many respects, though not in all, a version of the young Trollope. As the novel begins, he is what Trollope famously defines as a hobbledehoy, that is, a youth who is no longer a boy, but is finding it difficult to grow into the full stature of a man. He has an uncertain sense of what his priorities should be. He is generally bad at managing his money affairs and still worse at managing his relations with young women. He's socially awkward and prone to be underestimated by his elders. But nevertheless, he has a strong sense of honour and a strong imagination. Johnny Eames, famous of course, is probably the most celebrated example of a hobbledehoy in Trollope's fiction, but there are a number of others, and in all such examples, Trollope is, at least in part, thinking of himself. His autobiography makes it clear that in Charlie's experience of gaining admission to the civil service as a junior clerk, and in his subsequent entanglements with an Irish barmaid and a relentless moneylender, Trollope is recalling his own early struggles. Of the three clerks we are introduced to at the beginning of the novel, Charlie is the one who clearly seems to be the least likely to make a success of his life. Harry Norman is a representative of a more privileged class. He's better educated, he's more confident, he has more money, and he has been brought up as a country squire, the identity to which Trollope eventually returns him. Every inch a gentleman, and he is generous and loyal. But Harry, for all his many solid virtues, has flaws, and Trollope intends that his readers should notice them. There is a kind of weakness in Harry, who is too inclined to take too much for granted. He hesitates to expose himself to the chances and vagaries of a rough and tumble world. He is representative of a more settled way of life, an appealing representative, but the novel doesn't wholly endorse his values. We don't really see Harry learning and growing much in this novel. Harry is not the future. Alaric, on the other hand, sees himself very much as the future, and not in a good way. He too has virtues. He's courageous. He is not entirely without moral principle, or at least not in the early stages of the novel, and he has abundant ambition, but he is a man on the make, and he puts the interests of his own potential advancement above all else. Of course, he allows himself to become an unprincipled speculator, suffers a terrible fall, and ends up in prison. A truly disgraceful fate for a man with his background and professional aspirations. And of course, finally sets off with his wife Gertrude to Australia, where he has to start all over again, chastened and humbled. Much of the narrative drive of the novel is bound up with the rise and fall of Alaric and its parallels in his courtships among the Woodward girls. First, without commitment, with the gentle Linda, thinking in his self-interested way that it might be useful to raise an interest in Linda's heart. And then with Gertrude, who looks like a better bet as the wife of a rising man and has rejected the love of Harry Norman. Harry, though he has found a worthy wife in Linda, is characteristically and not altogether creditably intransigent and never forgives him. Alaric's fall doesn't happen without the assistance of someone who continually pushes him along his downward path, the Honourable Undecimus Scott, the evil genius of the novel and the source of much of its interest. Undy, as he is known, is the 11th son of the relatively impoverished Scottish Lord Gaberlunzie. So he is of aristocratic lineage without any accompanying wealth, a dangerous combination. And Undy is, from first to last, a very bad lot. He has no moral values whatsoever, nor any respect for duty, honour, even the law, and his ruthless pursuit of worldly success puts Alaric's dubious activities in the shade. Supposedly honourable and a member of the nobility, he is decidedly not honourable and certainly not noble. The strongest feeling of the novel, and this is a novel of strong feeling, is directed towards Undy Scott. Undy would have to come pretty near to the top of any league table of Trollope's villains. He has quite a lot of competition, of course. Augustus Melmotte, George Vavasor, Adolphus Crosby, Obadiah Slope, Felix Carberry. It's quite a long list. And we'd all have our own contenders as to who is the very worst. I think I'd put Felix Carberry down as my own favourite candidate, but he has rivals. It might be interesting, in fact, to have a vote. But none is quite as vicious, as treacherous, as predatory, or as deceitful as Undy Scott. He functioned in the novel as a satanic tempter, drawing Alaric into a series of increasingly corrupt dealings in shares and finally into the out-and-out financial abuse of using the funds entrusted to him as Miss Golightly's trustee for his own shady investments. That abuse turns out to be a step too far and makes a convicted criminal out of the aspiring Alaric. And Undy's betrayal of his supposed friend, the man whose hopeful career and reputation he has entirely destroyed, as he denies all responsibility for Alaric's actions and attempts to blackmail him, is quite breathtakingly repellent. In fact, Undy's wickedness is so extreme that we do have to ask ourselves what is going on. Why is Trollope presenting us with this a theatrical villain in quite such lurid terms? And the answer to this question, it seems to me, has a good deal to do with Charles Dickens. Many critics have noted, and no doubt this is something that you will have noticed yourselves, that The Three Clerks is a novel that engages closely with Dickens, then at the height of his reputation, and it engages with unusual directness. As Trollope was finding his own feet and a sense of his own worth as a novelist, he was beginning to think that he might hope to stand on equal terms with Dickens. The presentation of the civil service in The Three Clerks is, in part, a response to Dickens's contemptuous dismissal of the Circumlocution Office in Little Dorrit, published in 1857. It's prompted by the feeling that Trollope, in writing about the civil service, knew what he was talking about, unlike Dickens. Excuse me. The novel doesn't by any means provide unqualified support for the doings of the civil service. Excuse me. But it does acknowledge it as a serious, and, at least in the weights and measures department, a disciplined and significant feature of national life. As far as the Internal Navigation Office is concerned, well, not so much, but that's another matter. Little Dorrit had fired Trollope up to mount a defence of the institution that he owed so much to. And Dickens appears elsewhere in the novel, particularly in Crinoline and Macassar, Charlie's first attempt at fiction. One of the, I think, stylistic challenges and problems of the novel, the extent to which the satire is, how can I put it, the extent to which I think it is overused in the Three Clerks, but that might be a matter for opinion. But we do know that Dickensian references appear in the mention of Lady Crinoline's acquiring her finery from Madame Mantalini. For instance, Madame Mantalini is a character in Nicholas Nickleby, or to Mrs. Gamp as midwife to Lady Crinoline's baby. Sarah Gamp appears as a comic character in Martin Chuzzlewit. But the central point of engagement with Dickens is in the presentation of Undy Scott's villainy. The point that Trollope is making with real vehemence is that Scott, Undy that is especially blameworthy because of his social class and the advantages and responsibilities that come with that privileged standing. With all those advantages, Undy very deliberately decides to put himself first and to inflict harm on others. He was equipped to choose the right path, and he consciously chooses the wrong one. And the contrast he wants to make in fictional terms is with Bill Sikes, Nancy's brutal murderer in Oliver Twist, one of the most notorious characters in 19th century fiction. But Bill, although he must be hanged, was born into poverty, with none of the comfortable opportunities available to Undy. Trollope makes the point at some length. I'm sure you'll remember the passage, but I'll just take a moment to remind you and read it to you. Lady, Trollope begins, and interesting that he addresses what is to come specifically to a hypothetical woman. Lady, you now know them both. Is it not the fact that, knowing him as you do, you could spend a pleasant hour enough with Mr. Scott, sitting next to him at dinner, whereas your blood would creep within you, your hair would stand on end, your voice would stick in your throat if you were suddenly told that Bill Sikes was in your presence? Poor Bill! I have a sort of love for him as he walks about wretched with that dog of his, though I know that it is necessary to hang him. Yes, Bill, I, your friend, cannot gainsay that, must acknowledge that, hard as the case may be, you must be hung out of the way of further mischief. My spoons, my wife's throat, my children's brains demand that. You, Bill, and polecats and such like must be squelched when we can come across you, seeing that you make yourself so universally disagreeable. It is your ordained nature to be disagreeable. You plead silently. I know it. I admit the hardship of your case, But still, my Bill, self-preservation is the first law of nature. You must be hung. But while hanging you, I admit that you are more sinned against than sinning. There is another, Bill, another, who will surely take account of this in some way, though it is not for me to tell you how. Yes, I hang Bill Sikes with soft regret. But with what a savage joy, with what exultation of heart, with what alacrity of eager soul, with what aptitude of mind to the deed would I hang my friend Undy Scott, the Member of Parliament for the Tillytudlem boroughs, if I could but get at his throat for such a purpose. Hang him, aye, as high as Haman. In this there would be no regret, no vacillation of purpose, no doubt as to the propriety of the sacrifice, no feeling that I was so treating him not for his own desert, but for my advantage. So it's a very strange passage, that. Speaking of the love, and he uses that word, a sort of love he held for Bill Sikes, and of soft regret for his hanging, does seem to me to be going it, given what happened to Nancy. But Trollope's point is clear. Undy had been brought up to be a gentleman. Bill had not. And Trollope's anger against those who dismiss the obligations of their class is fierce. Now, Trollope could, of course, with ease, had he so wished, have found the narrative means to hang Undy. Of course, he is the one who is in charge of Undy's story. But the Undy Scotts of this world are not hung, nor are they imprisoned. They are too clever and too slippery for that. Nevertheless, Undy's humiliating evisceration by the lawyer Chaffanbrass, who is making his first memorable appearance in the novel's compelling trial scenes, is very gratifying to the reader. Undy does not go unpunished, and Trollope describes the fate he has devised for him, an exile among the gaming tables of Europe, with gleeful satisfaction. And I can't resist reading this passage too. How he poked his honourable card in everyone's way and lugged Lord Gaberlunzie into all conversations. How his face became pimply and his wardrobe seedy, and how at last his wretched life will ooze out from him in some dark corner, like the filthy juice of a decayed fungus, which makes hideous the hidden wall on which it bursts. All this is unnecessary more particularly to describe. I pause there to say that actually Trollope has described it pretty well. He's probably still living, and those who desire his acquaintance will find him creeping round some gaming table and trying to look as though he had in his pocket ample means to secure those hoards of money which men are so listlessly raking about. From our view, he has vanished. Trollope's contempt for Undy turns on the issue of class, and Trollope's view of class is very different from that of Dickens. And class also underlies the other question which arouses his campaigning energy in this novel, the question of his long-standing hostility to the relatively new system of competitive examination as the means of entry to the civil service, as introduced by Sir Charles Trevelyan, who becomes Sir Geoffrey Hardlines in The Three Clerks. Charlie Tudor's desultory examination to join the lowly ranks of the infernal navvies is a memory of Trollope's own experience, as he explains in his autobiography. Neither Charlie nor Trollope himself would have been admitted on the basis of their performance, and Trollope freely concedes the point. But their ineptitude is not, Trollope argues, the real point. So, what is the point? The real point is that Charlie and Trollope were both gentlemen, endowed with the proper values of gentlemen, and that was their basic qualification for the role. Some professional occupations, as Trollope saw them, should be reserved for gentlemen, clergymen, judges, officers in the army or navy, members of parliament. Now, of course, what Trollope means by that term gentleman is not at all easy or even perhaps possible to define. And Trollope is somewhat defensive in discussing the matter in his autobiography. He knows full well that he found that first vital job as a clerk in the post office through patronage and not through merit. But he stands firm in his argument that he was fitted for the role, as was Charlie. But nothing is ever entirely simple in Trollope's fiction, as you know, and this issue too is not simple. It is not just because Charlie is a gentlemanly scapegrace that, in spite of his unpromising beginnings, he is the only one of the three clerks to make a success of his profession. It is also because of his approach to his work. Harry Norman is also a gentleman and much better behaved than young Charlie. But Harry's heart is not really in his work, and he lacks Charlie's willingness to adapt his behaviour in order to make a go of things. Harry is obstinate, intransigent, and he will not adapt. And like others in Trollope's fiction who refuse to change in the face of a changing world, he is finally defeated, for his resignation from the service is a kind of retreat, although he retreats into a very well-padded life. A turning point in the novel comes with the competitive examination that he and Alaric undergo for an important promotion. Alaric is not really prepared for the exam, but he approaches the ordeal with a kind of indomitable spirit that means he deserves his success, although it's not a triumph that the reader can entirely approve. Harry's withdrawal from a process that he finds uncomfortable and threatens him with the possibility of humiliation is less than impressive. For all Trollope's disapproval of the exam, there is something cowardly about Harry's tiptoeing away. And Charlie, like Johnny Eames, never lacks courage. Johnny, you remember, confronts the bull to save the Earl's life. Charlie jumps into the Thames to save Katie's life. And both are eventually rewarded. In the end, the three clerks all find their way circuitously into lives that their fathers had to some extent defined for them. Charlie's father had been a gentlemanly clergyman. Alaric's father was a member of the country gentry. I'm sorry, Harry's father was a member of the country gentry. Alaric's father was a spendthrift cavalry officer. And this is not a novel that advocates any kind of social revolution. And yet it isn't altogether the kind of solemn endorsement of the status quo that I'm perhaps making it sound like. What I've left out, and in doing so I've left out much of the real life of the novel, is its inclination to play. For this is among the most playful of Trollope's novels, perhaps the most playful. And that explains the somewhat overextended joke of Lady Caroline and Macassar. It's a form of play. The three young Woodward women and their mother don't take themselves too seriously. And Mrs. Woodward, remember, she is named at one point unexpectedly by Trollope as his favourite character in the book, doesn't repress the high spirits of her three daughters and the young men who come into her house. Their play is based on close bonds, despite their different natures, and their affectionate relations are delicately and I think sometimes really movingly evoked. But Charlie, the youngest of the three men who are admitted into the company of the Woodwards, is the one who enters most wholeheartedly into their world, especially through his growing attachment to Katie, who becomes a young woman before she quite understands what is happening. And they share an imaginative creativity. It's such an important consonance in the novel. Charlie enters wholeheartedly into Katie's games of fantasy palaces on the island, a version of the castles in the air that Trollope describes himself as building in the youth that he remembers in his autobiography. I quote here, "She and Charlie indeed went off by themselves to a desert island, or a place that would have been a desert island had the water run round it, and there they built stupendous palaces and laid out glorious gardens. Katie is Charlie's chief partner in play, and this is among the threads that bind their lives together. But Charlie has other partners in different kinds of play, and the lawless exuberance of the young men in the Internal Navigation Office is another of the many ways in which Trollope recalls his own early years in this novel. Trollope isn't pretending that their behaviour is defensible, though he does present them as explicable. A group of young men together in London without any serious work to do, for the infernal navvies are in effect already obsolete before they are disbanded, and without any means to regulate their behaviour. Of course they behave badly. What else can be expected? And of course they get into trouble in the ways that Charlie gets into trouble. But they are high-spirited and irrepressible, and no real harm is done, except perhaps to Nora Geraghty, the barmaid who is angling for marriage with Charlie. And Trollope does spare a thought for Nora, as he spares a thought for Johnny Eames's Amelia Roper. Young women who are compelled to undertake the mundane work of the world are easy victims for the Charlies and Johnnies of Trollope's London, and Trollope occasionally reminds us of that uncomfortable fact. But Charlie and Nora would not have been happy as man and wife. The connection between Charlie and Trollope's own years as a hobbledehoy is confirmed most clearly in Charlie's life as an inspiring writer. And of course, that is where the book's delight in play is at its most apparent. I, for one, do find I've said this already, really, Crinoline and Macassar, a spoof novel produced by the naive Charlie, rather longer than readers might now wish, but it has its funny moments and it demonstrates Trollope's growing confidence in his own skills. And the context in which it's read aloud, with the irreverent banter of the Woodward women running alongside, evokes a social world which is not to be wholly confined by the vicissitudes and misfortunes of its central characters. This isn't a novel without its challenges to the tastes of most modern readers. Again, speaking for myself, I do find the girlish Katie just a little tiresome in her winning ways, which Trollope occasionally leans on very heavily. I quote, "Poor Katie, dear, darling, bonny Katie, sweet, sweetest, dearest child." That's a bit much for me. And the scene where she believes herself to be separated from Charlie forever, and dying of a broken heart and says farewell to him for the last time, is again, for me, a little excessive in its emotion. For me, but not for Trollope, who recalls that scene in his autobiography. The passage in which Katie Woodward, thinking that she will die, tries to take leave of the lad she loves, still brings tears to my eyes when I read it. I had not the heart to kill her. I never could do that. And I do not doubt that they are living happily together to this day. Katie is functioning throughout as the antithesis to Undy Scott, and as such is essential to the very patterned structure of this novel. I began by saying that the novel's unusual, and one of the ways in which this is true is in its refusal of the kind of narrative closure that Trollope customarily provides, though we're not kept in the dark as to what happens to the central characters. But this is a novel that ends tellingly, I think, with young people at play, as a supposedly hostile review of Charlie's fiction, in fact a mock-up constructed by Katie, is read aloud by Mrs. Woodward in a scene echoing the chapters where Crinoline Macassar is read aloud. And the story concludes with the family chasing each other around the garden and with an open-ended question from Captain Cutwater. What the devil is all the row about? But there was nobody to answer him. Thank you.